Sri Aurobindo is commenting on the term mind of our mind from the Kena Upanishad. And this entire chapter discusses the necessity of this super mind, Vijnana, mind of our mind. And he takes many approaches describing the perspectives of the material science, a psychological approach, places them in relation to the Vedic approach, and logically convinces us that there has to be a principle above mind, and in nature's evolution, the mind itself being insufficient, this higher principle is obviously the culmination of the evolution and the secret purpose for which nature is working out this series of ascent in evolution. In the last paragraph we read, Sri Aurobindo gives us a comprehensive perspective linking matter, life, mind to supermind. And he says, there is one law from the lowest to the highest. And that is, at each level, we find instinct, the tendencies of the next level. And because they are operating instinct, they are not so obvious. But through the movement of the instinct, there is an organization of the means by which the next level of consciousness can emerge and directly express itself. So in dead matter are the instincts of life, which eventually, as they organize themselves, become the expression of life. In that expression of life are the instincts of mind, which as it emerges and organizes itself, you have the appearance of an expressive mind. And finally, within our mind too, are the instincts of the supermind, and we saw what they were. And these are emerging gradually, organizing themselves, and as they come into their own in a self-organization, we will see supermind also expressed. In this big picture, we also recognize that in life which is instinct in matter, is already instinct secretly mind, within which is instinct supermind. And therefore, just looking at matter and the processes of matter, we can distinguish the life processes, behind that the mind guiding, and behind that the supermind. I had one beautiful example which I thought worth sharing, and this is a stone which is cut from nature. Had we seen it in its normal form, it would be just a lump of rock. We are taught that this is formed by a burst of lava which is thrown out, and it falls, cools down, and becomes this lump of rock. But when you actually cut it open, and this is just a slice which has been cut open, and there's another stone similarly cut open, and you see the intricacy of the organization inside, it is not homogeneous. It is not a lump of lava which is thrown, which hardened. There was an entire process which continued inside the rock. And if you see the layers from the outermost, which is hard as a crust, a transparent layer which is almost white, within that the formation of a bluish layer which has rings within it like a tree. And the series of rings eventually open out to another clear center. And within that further rings where there's a mix of blue, and you can see clear lines showing there was a series of steps in the process. And they become more and more transparent, crystalline. And finally, at the center, it is as if those crystals are forming something new, almost like a seed which is being formed inside. If you look at this, the evidence purely shows an ongoing process within dead matter, which follows exactly the same sequence as in the tree's growth, the same kind of ring structure. Even in the tree, in the center is the most rich living stem, around which are the less and less rich, more dense, less active layers. And you see something similar even here, from the center outwards. Actually, the formation is out to the center, but whatever it is, we see exactly the same process. And if you look at this carefully, it reminds you also of an egg. And here is a completely different stone, which follows a similar pattern of different layers, a different kind of process, but similar layer-wise, eventually culminating in something in the center, again looking at an egg, like an egg. That we see common across all levels. Here in the stone, then in the egg, the same structure internally, where the chicken forms, a faster process, that is all. And then in the human body, if you look at the stem of the spine, place it like this, and outside is the bone, and inside, layered through the layers at the very core, is the condensed bundle of nerves going all the way from the brain down to the rest of the body. Inside a bone, similarly, you will find the same kind of structure. At the core of the bone structure is the most living substance, which is generating red blood cells. The very basis of the life organization is taking place right at the core, in the center. The most living part is in the center. Just as in the tree, the same way in the bone. If you take a tooth and cut it, slice it, you'll find similarly at the very center is the most living, sensitive substance. And the brain equally. The same image you will find reflected in formations of galaxies. In the structure of a planet, at the very core is the most living, most dynamic activity going on, from where all the magnetic and electric fields are generated by which Earth becomes capable of sustaining life and protecting itself from the harsh radiations from the sun in space. The same structure in the galaxy and the same structure in the cosmos, the totality of the cosmos. And in the Sanskrit vocabulary, we call it Brahmanda. The Anda is egg. Brahman, the consciousness, transcending, becomes egg-like. Brahmanda, the egg of Brahman, is the cosmos. It is very symbolic because it is representing also of the egg which manifests, which builds the form and then expresses. But also the entire universe is held egg-like within the consciousness of Brahman. So you see the same symbol going across all levels of organization in the material plane and representing the same life processes in stone, in tree, in biology of the mammal, and even on a spiritual level symbolically, the cosmos. So this idea of one law expressed across is something very special to the way Sri Aurobindo is showing us the universe. We tend to think otherwise of different laws, different principles on different planes. Yes, that also is true. But the law of their development, the law of their unfoldment, the law of their expression is one single law. And then there are secondary expressions of that law which are unique to each level. And those are the characteristics which we have read, and most important, in our mind. The instincts with the stuff of supermind, sympathies, unities, intuitions, emergences of pre-existing knowledge, instincts, imperative lights and movements, inherent self-effectivities of will, all of which disguise themselves in mental processes. These are the promise of something greater emerging. Is that emergence more vivid now? Is it growing? Is it becoming more obvious? Sri Aurobindo comments, and we go to the next paragraph. This necessary preparation is proceeding in human development. This is the preparation of the conditions in which this new consciousness can express itself directly. Is proceeding in human development as the corresponding preparations were developed in the lower stages of the evolution. So if we were to go back a few billion years perhaps, before we see the appearance of mammals, we see only trees perhaps and some very simple organisms, we might not have thought possible that living tissue which can move around on its own could ever be possible. And yet, through a process that developed, and in the same way the development is taking place in us, he says, with the same gradations, retardations, inequalities. But still, it is more enlightened, increasingly self-conscious, nearer to a conscious sureness. So first, the common characteristics across all these in the evolution: same gradations, retardations, inequalities. What are these gradations? Sri Aurobindo describes in great detail how evolution follows a kind of a ladder of consciousness. So, if we step back and look at the big picture, from the one consciousness of Brahman, there are as if 7 grades of vibration, 7 kinds of active expression of consciousness, 7 powers of consciousness. And as these 7 move into expression, they are not differentiated from each other. They are one movement which has 7 aspects. And therefore, even as they differentiate in exercising themselves in a specific way, all the others are embedded within each. And therefore we find 7 into 7. Within each of the 7 are again all 7. But does that stop? Within each of those sub-planes of the 7 is the totality again. And therefore one can say there is a further division of 7 within each of those. So 49 gradations into another 7 going deeper within. Does it stop there? Within each of those there could be the expression of any others. And so ad infinitum. It is by this principle that the whole evolution can become so intensely rich. Although emerging from a single, indivisible consciousness, its expression in manifestation is astoundingly rich, unimaginably rich. And if at any point we say this is all that is possible, nature somehow breaks that rule and shows you she can do something which you thought impossible, which you could not even imagine could be possible. Because everything is embedded within everything else as a potential. And therefore anything can combine, anything can emerge out of anywhere. It just takes time. So he says the same gradations. And here the idea is, at each major step of evolution, there have been these seven steps in between, which have had to be developed in order for that evolution of that level to be complete. Now if you just look at the human body, Ayurveda describes Sapta Dhatu, 7 kinds of distinct materials with which the body is composed. First of all, there is the densest part, which is the bone structure. And then there has to be the muscle, without which the bone could not move. It would be one rigid thing. And then, over that movement, there has to be the nerves, which allow for sensation and communication and coordination of these movements. So already 3 levels, the tamasic, the rajasic and the sattvic, if you look at just the correspondence. But upon that, there has to be something which carries life force to every corner of the body, the blood. And so on. It describes 7 categories of substance without which you cannot have the complete self-contained independent life form. Each of these took time to organize itself. In evolution, first one of these was developed sufficiently that it provided a base for another to be more developed, which provided a base for another to be more developed, although at each step, all 7 were somehow internally bound to each other. And so in this way, going through a series of 7 distinct developments, all combined into a single one, you have the full expression of life. But the first full expression of life with the 7 combined is crude and coarse. Out of that crude and coarse, each of these 7 further becomes more rich, more refined, more capable, diverse, plastic, expressive, and that makes for the more complex forms. And so you find 7 levels need to be developed, expressed, integrated, organized, and then more richly developed for each major step of evolution. Our mind, similarly, has also within it these gradations. In a different text, Sri Aurobindo describes 10 steps within each. And this is just a different way of looking at it, but principally one can say, whether 10 or 7, there are these distinct steps repeating each time. But there's a greater complexity. When out of matter, life has first begun to express itself, it has organized itself sufficiently that we say, yes, this is a living being. That life force turns upon all the gradations before. And upon each of them, it begins to exercise its influence and raise them to express its principle more and more directly. And so the whole thing takes place all over again under the influence of this next higher power. Similarly, when mind becomes more active, and you can say now this is an expressive mind in the animal, it turns upon the life and matter, and all those levels it recasts in its terms. The result is that the human tissue, for example, body tissue, because it has been worked upon by the mind consciousness, the body tissue itself is more sensitive, more self-aware than similar tissue of a less developed animal. The senses may be more developed in the animal, but the tissue being self-aware is superior in the human, which is superior from animals to plant life. The tissue's self-awareness in plant is less developed, less expressive, which is itself greater than the tissue self-awareness of stone or so-called dead matter. And so each time the higher consciousness turns downwards and recasts not only the substance, raising it in its terms, transmuting it, transforming it, but also reorganizing their working to express its influence more directly. So in the human being, we see this most obviously, that we have a greater possibility of controlling our own instinct. The animal is as if defined by its instinctive behavior. It cannot stand back and override its instinct. With a few exceptions, I had mentioned earlier the dolphin, which is able to stand back from its own triggered anger and choose not to be angry. So some of these highly developed animals, which have come very close to self-awareness of mind, do have that capacity. But the extent of the human capacity is far greater. Not only we are able to override our instincts, we are able to reprogram, modify our instincts, redefine and reprogram them. So for example, you find that your body instinctively tends to behave in a certain way. Let's say when it eats a certain food, it tends to have gas in the stomach, or it tends to not digest certain types of food. You can will upon the body and make it capable now of dealing with it differently. There's a very interesting series of correspondence from Sri Aurobindo with Nagin Doshi. He used to have constantly a problem of loose motions. And Sri Aurobindo repeatedly in the letters refers to it as this habit of the body. And says you have to put a will to change that habit. These are functions which are inherently automatic. Digestive processes are automatic, driven primarily by instinct. And yet the mind imposing itself on it can modify them. Our fingers, we can consciously train to be able to do things for which they were not originally designed, or which animal life could never think worth developing. For example, to play the flute, or play the piano, to hold a pencil, to type on a computer. Now these are all specialized uses which become relevant only when the mind turns upon the fingers and trains them to do these things. And over the last whatever number of millions of years that we have actually worked on the finger consciousness to make them more expressive for the mind, that capacity has got embedded in the species. And therefore today, a child at the age of 5 or 6 can take a pencil and write with ease. And perhaps in another generation, the same children will be able to type on the computer with ease, because that habit perhaps also may be embedded in the species. And so there is a continuous influence of the mind turning upon all these. Not only on the tissue, on the life processes, but on mind processes themselves. We train our mind to think better. In school, we have a whole framework not only to give informational knowledge, but to activate and intensify the faculties of the mind. Imagination, creativity, logic, etc., observation. We train children to develop them, and as a result, those same children, as they grow into adulthood, have a far greater capacity than those who have not been trained or who have not pursued the training instinctively. So at each level, there is a turning back upon all the previous levels to recast them and then to reorganize the whole life. So in the human life, our whole life is led by our mind values. When we sit down to eat, we make a big show of it. We wear special clothes, we lay out the plate, we lay out the spoon or fork, we put the glass, we arrange things, we make the food in different colors, tastes, flavors. The exercise itself of eating, which in the animal was instinctive just to fill the stomach and get nourishment, has been turned into almost like an art, or even a sacred ritual, if you push it further, to divinity. And in this way, the whole form in its totality of life is raised into mental values. Exactly the same process is happening, will happen more and more explicitly as these instincts of the stuff of supermind within us begin to develop, to become more explicit, to organize themselves and come into their own. They turn upon the rest of the human mind first, and then life, and eventually even the tissue of the body, to gradually make them expressive of that consciousness more and more directly. This is most obvious in humanity, in those beings that we call genius. What is genius after all, except for some of these faculties which we described last time, the instincts of the supermind, operating through the guise of mental processes. But it is even more obvious in those who have consciously cultivated these higher ranges of mind through the process of yoga. And in them we find such a rapid development that it seems as if evolution itself is irrelevant. In one of the letters, Sri Aurobindo refers to the example of one person who was the tabla player for one of the disciples. He came as a tabla player, having had no formal education, no special skill or capacity except to be able to play the tabla. But having come here within 2 years, he began to express extraordinary skill of painting, art, even higher kinds of music. Others who had a more readiness to develop were spouting extraordinary poetry, music, literature, art. One of the most extraordinary was Roman Palit, who was a genius in all of these at the same time. And the interesting part was, when he left the ashram, for whatever reason, and went back to his old ways, the whole thing collapsed. When he came back later to the ashram and saw the kinds of things he had written, he wept, because it was something beyond his reach. And you can see immediately that all of these higher possibilities were the result of the yoga. They were developed by and sustained by the yoga. When he withdrew from that yoga and turned to something which was more the instinctive mental life, they diffused, weakened, and even faded away. And to recover them would require again the process of yoga. But by the process of yoga, that evolution, which would have taken perhaps many lives, was compressed within a few years. And so Sri Aurobindo points to these explicitly to show how much more effective and how much more rapid the yogic process can be. So this emergence of these powers of supermind turn upon the mind, amplify their capacities, even turn upon life and even the physical body. And we saw the examples last time of the intuition in the physical consciousness. So with the same gradations, we find this preparation proceeding, and then with the same retardations. And the retardations are another feature you see in the earlier phases of evolution. Each time a new level is attempted, it is as if acquired and expressed, and then unable to hold its own, and it collapses, to fall back to the previous level, and then prepare to make a new effort. Sometimes repeated efforts before it can find itself sufficiently stable. Or when it makes that first attempt, it expresses something but with enormous limitations in other areas. So the mother explains how each time evolution has moved forward, it has lost its preeminent character of the previous stage. Matter, for example, has permanence. It can last millions of years. But life emerging in plant, it lasts only a few years or a few centuries at most. But those which last very long time are almost stone-like in their rigidity and hardness. The most plastic plants, which are able to climb like creepers and move around freely, quickly, grow rapidly, they have shorter lifespans. The emergence of mind, similarly, from life involved the loss of life's resilience. It became more fragile. In the human being, that fragility is so extreme. Unlike a horse, which after birth needs barely 10 or 15 minutes to be able to stand on its legs and trot around independently, the human baby needs several years to be able to stand on its own legs, and even then it is totally dependent. It needs a decade before it can become independent. And so we see that each subsequent step has had to have some loss. And particularly in this case, the mother points out how from the ape to the human, we lost the physical strength, the physical suppleness, the skill of swinging from one branch to the other and leaping with that surety which the ape has in order to gain mind. So when a new step takes place, it may involve such a heavy loss on other levels that the step itself becomes unstable and collapses. Or the step is unable to hold its own in opposition to the resistance of the previous stages, and so collapses. And often repeated attempts are required before it can come into its own with sufficient stability. Here again, Sri Aurobindo makes a cryptic remark in the very first, I think, the first chapter of the Life Divine. He says, the sign that the human being is able to rapidly grow in the power of the intellect, even when you pull a human being from the most undeveloped tribal consciousness, within a single generation it is able to catch up with the full power of the intellect almost. This, he says, is itself a sign that the attempt of the development of the intellect has been made before. Not only the intellect, but even the attempt for the intuition was made before, and that failed. It fell back. And therefore now the new attempt to complete the development of the intellect and to rise again into intuition. Why did it fail before? In the ascent into intuition, the step before of development of intellect was not sufficiently, richly completed. And therefore intuition itself fell back to a more instinctive, we will say, religious kind of mindset, from which once again the intellect had to emerge to separate from the instinct of religious mentality, stand back, question, doubt everything, and once it has come into its own and made itself rich enough, again the attempt for intuition's development is made. But this time it seems it will succeed, because of all the previous failed attempts which have built a sufficient base for integration and completeness of these levels. Now all of this shows us how much struggle nature has had to go through to build one tiny of the sevenfold of the sevenfold steps. At each of those tiniest 149th or 7 times 49th variation or step, there has been a similar struggle. And then of course the struggle of the integration and so on. So retardations, the same retardations as before in the lower stages of evolution, are appearing in the current attempt of the human development's process. I will point to 1 or 2 examples of how this retardation is expressing. I had an interesting visit to a school for retarded children. Now it is not politically correct to say retarded, so they say special children. But I don't think that's the right word to use. But whatever. So in this place, the principal of the school told me, it's such a joy to be with them. And she said, one thing they cannot do, they cannot lie. And if you think about it, there has been some kind of a incapacity in the mental development, some damage at a biological level or in the formation of the mind. But the character of that incapacity is they are truthful. They are not embarrassed about what is true. They will tell you frankly, oh, this is what happened, this is what I did. And that's it. If you think about that, it points to precisely the character of a truth consciousness, where lying and self-deception are not natural, are inimical to it. Mother, in fact, points to this as one of the characteristics. As the supramental consciousness emerges and organizes itself, she said, just as the human mind lost the ape's strength and skill, the supramental being first will lose the highest capacity of the intellect. And the highest capacity of the intellect, she said, is the skill to deceive itself, the skill to lie to itself, not just to others, to deceive itself so thoroughly and justify a falsehood so skillfully that it appears to be true. That is the acme of its skill. And that will be gone. And that gone means you cannot deceive yourself anymore. The power of the mind will be there, but you can't deceive. And you see this precisely as the tendency among these retarded children. And then, of course, you would like to call them special, but in this way. But then the principal commented there is an epidemic of attention deficit disorders everywhere in the world. It's happening in epidemic proportions. Now we can give it many reasons. And there are physical reasons also, as well as psychological reasons. And among the physical reasons are the enormous amounts of poisons which we are putting into our foods, which entering the body damage the formation of the nervous system and thence the capacity of the mind and so on. It has been shown through studies that the coloring which are added in foods, packaged foods, they irritate the nerves and make the mind restless and unable to hold attention. You remove those colorings from the food diet and the same mind quickly becomes more calm and clear and centered, effortlessly. So there are biological perhaps triggers. Nevertheless, they point to something happening on a mass scale, the likes of which we have never seen before. The supermind in its development can use all these occasions to push forward its own needs and organize itself in its own ways. But at first, each of these are expressions of retardation, failures, incapacities to sustain a new development. And I think it is the mother who comments on this. She says, sometimes when nature is trying to push rapidly and too rapidly a new possibility which has not yet been organized, she comes up with defective formations because she's trying out what will work. And often these retarded or otherwise physically disabled children are an expression of nature's attempts to push into new directions. But once nature finds a way, then she quickly concentrates all her energies in that way and then from there moves to further steps. So same retardations as developed in the lower stages of evolution are also proceeding in the human development along with those gradations. So gradations, retardations, inequalities. And this is when, although different parts have been brought into their own, they are not yet harmonized. One part is developed in exaggeration, another part in insufficiency, and there is an imbalance in the character, in the nature, in the capacity even to express. Often this imbalance we see as what are called genius savants, or another word slips my mind, where children are unusually intelligent but deficient in social skills. They somehow cannot relate emotionally easily. They are either numb, insensitive emotionally, or they are too sensitive and create a layer of insensitivity to protect themselves, which is more often the case. And so there are terms which are given to this in the domain of psychiatry. They want to treat them with medicine. But if you understand that this is just an imbalance in the development of different parts, you can intervene and help to develop those parts and bring back a greater balance. This is the reason why in the ashram schools training, the mother insisted that children should not be permitted to specialize as long as they are in the school. So there were many children who had unusual aptitudes or gifts and they wanted to concentrate only on those, and they have always been denied and prevented from that kind of an unbalanced specialization or exaggerated one-sided growth. She wanted a rounded, complete development of the personality. After that is done, you can specialize all you want in your interests. But these inequalities are often appearing in nature, as we have seen in older gradations of evolution, which makes those species or those variations within the species somehow incapable, unstable, more fragile, more vulnerable to environmental variations. But similar things happening also in human beings. A lot of unusual sensitivities are also signs of this. So, same gradations, retardations, inequalities as the lower stages. are proceeding in human development. But these are the one side, the other side which is special, not common to the previous stages. But still it is more enlightened, increasingly self-conscious, nearer to a conscious sureness. So the action itself of these developments takes place in a consciousness which is more aware. What is the word used to describe children who are introverted? Autistic, yes. Autistic children, for example, there are children who seem not to respond to external stimuli. We call them autistic. But often they have unusual capacities, unusual intelligence. In a few cases where they have been helped to emerge and express themselves, break out of that shell, they've been able to describe what it is they were doing. So there's a very interesting talk by one such who says that I would look at the reflection of the light on some object and then trace back the path from where the light came, and from that reflection trace back and observe how the light is bouncing all over the room, and I would be fascinated and immersed in this. And if somebody spoke to me, I would either not bother or get irritated that they were disturbing my enjoyable activity, for example. So very often it happens when people are in intense states of concentration in some activity, programming or such. If you speak to them, they will respond mechanically, but they will have no memory of their response. They will say, yes, I am coming. And after half an hour you say, but I'm waiting for you. Oh, did you tell me? I don't remember. Or they get irritated, there's a strong reaction. But these are states in which your whole consciousness is concentrated in some interior state, subjective, but so rich, so complete, so enjoyable in itself that the whole world as if doesn't matter. You're in a kind of a trance, but a trance in the mind consciousness. And this is a special experience, not so common in previous stages of human experience of life. It is only with computers that this has become possible to this degree. But there is a higher awareness involved. Even in this, each of these steps, the consciousness is more conscious. It is able to deal with these difficulties with a greater awareness, and so more enlightened. It is taking place in a consciousness which is higher, of a higher grade of awareness. Increasingly self-conscious, it is aware that it is doing this and that it can do differently, that it needs to intervene and can intervene, and nearer to a conscious sureness. And so at some point you feel, I know I can do this. I know this can be overcome. I know if I work at it long enough, if I put enough of my concentration, I can get free of that problem, balance this, overcome that, whatever it is. So there's a kind of an inherent surety, even in the limitations, to be able to overcome. And then to make new steps also there's a sureness. I know that if I concentrate myself sufficiently, I can know the answer to this problem. I know that if I concentrate sufficiently, I can sense what is happening far away. And one senses it with a kind of an internal sureness, nearer to a conscious sureness. So, this necessary preparation is proceeding in human development as the corresponding preparations were developed in the lower stages of the evolution, with the same gradations, retardations, inequalities. But still, it is more enlightened, increasingly self-conscious, nearer to a conscious sureness. Now, all of this is tenfold amplified in the yogic process. When we do the same thing by a yogic development, it is tenfold more enlightened, and because you're opening yourself to a higher consciousness, you have already a background and understanding of what you're doing and where it's leading. Increasingly self-conscious is also tenfold because you're concentrating attention on those parts, on those states, on those experiences, and therefore amplifying them, helping them to become more stable, more secure, intensifying the experience, stabilizing, habituating the mind and body to those experiences and states. And then nearer to a conscious sureness. This also tenfold, because you have learned to rely not only on some kind of inherent faith, Shraddha, an innate knowing, not a belief, but an innate knowing of the thing itself, but also to rely on the action of the divine grace and its support to your faith and within your faith. And you know this will be done. I can't say how long, but I know it will happen. Many times it has happened in the lives of sadhaks in the ashram that when they were asked certain questions regarding certain possibilities or their own efforts, they would become very quiet and then say with surety, yes, this will happen, or no, that will not happen. Just one example which comes to mind casually is when Nolinikanta Gupta was asked by his doctor. He had said, I don't want any injections ever. So he said that the doctor asked, but what if you are in such and such a state and then we need to give you an injection? That's how the medical mind works. So he became quiet for a while and then he said, it will not be necessary. Meaning, it will not happen, that situation will not happen. How did he know? There's a kind of an innate knowing of that, of the consciousness, in terms of its own life paths sometimes, in terms of the difficulties which it might meet. Another example of a very senior sadhak, without going into too much detail, a certain person came to meet him. And after that meeting, he said, the most difficult period of my life is beginning now. And it turned out that person was somehow associated with him and caused him a lot of distress. But he took it in his stride as part of his sadhana. How did he know? That's the consciousness within which senses, knows the direction and knows the entanglements of the karma or other requirements or even the responsibility given by the grace for a certain action and so on. So there is a sureness, a certainty, but consciously known, quite opposite to the surety and certainty which is inherent in instinct. The instinct drives you with a certainty also, but it doesn't know. It is not conscious of why it has to do this or for what purpose, what will be the outcome. The bird knows it has to pick up this twig and somehow move it. But why? It does not know. The human being, when it has this, because of the nature of intuition, when he knows why, he knows how, he knows where it's leading. So that's why he says conscious sureness. So the whole comparison is with instinct, which is infra-rational, and intuition, which is supra-rational. Both are similar in certain degrees. They act with precision, with knowledge. They act with precision, doing exactly what is needed. But in the instinct, the will is in front, the knowledge is hidden. In the intuition, the knowledge is in front and the will follows. But still it is more enlightened, increasingly self-conscious, nearer to a conscious sureness. And the very fact that this progress is attended by less absorption in the detail, less timidity of error, a less conservative attachment to the step gained, suggests, as much as it contradicts, the hope and almost the assurance that when the new principle emerges, it will not be by the creation of a new and quite different type, which separated after its creation will leave the rest of mankind in the same position to it as are the animals to man, but if not by the elevation of humanity as a whole to a higher level, yet by an opening of the greater possibility of all the race who have the will to rise. It's a very long sentence with a very intricate structure, very complex, with multiple negatives upon negatives. If you think about why he had to write it this way. You will see that it is the most condensed, pithy way of stating a very complex scenario that is taking place and the likely directions that this scenario is to unfold. But the whole scenario is based on three things. This progress in humanity of this new faculty, new consciousness emerging, is attended by three characteristics which point to this scenario. What are the three characteristics? Less absorption in the detail, less timidity of error, less conservative attachment to the step gained. So in the past, when you look at the lower stages of evolution, each detail had to be worked out minutely, stabilized, experimented upon, stabilized, made permanent, fixed in its tiniest detail. The result was less plastic, less elastic adaptability. So the instinct of the bird, although so skilled to pick with a single beak all these pieces of wood, twine and rope and weave this complex nest, it is unable to adapt to a situation for which it was not trained or for which the instinct has not developed. Outside the very narrow organization of the instinct's actions, the instinct falters. The animal is unable. So there has been a lot of focus on the detail and even an absorption in the detail to fix it. Second, timidity of error. In the past, nature made small steps so as not to make a big error. A small step which is then worked upon, tested, made sure, and then another small step and another small step. So you see much less error in those steps in the past. The evolution seems to be much more steady and sure of its steps. But in the human being, you do not find this. You find leaps, you find sudden changes, sudden shifts, and the errors are also possible, as we took examples before. Less absorption in detail. It is not fixing on one thing, it is moving around rapidly to touch upon many possibilities. A broad experiment, not a narrow experiment. And third, less conservative attachment to the step gained. So in the past, each step gained was given an exaggerated focus and importance, attaching itself, fixing it until it could never be lost. And then only the next step taken. And in the next step, the previous step was held on to so as not to lose it. And so the next step had to struggle harder. But it had greater surety, it had greater stability of its foundations, it could not lapse back so easily. But here, in the current development in the mind, the steps are much less conservatively attached. Yes, we try to stabilize something, but even before the stability is developed, there's an attempt to push to another finer layer, a finer possibility, another. Now, all of this he's describing is the instinct operating within us to develop these higher faculties of mind. But you'll notice exactly these things happen when we consciously participate in developing these faculties also. And that's the nature of the human mind. We say that we don't want to get stuck in one tiny detail. We want to develop many things. We want to broaden as quickly as possible so that we can apply it more generally, whatever faculty or capacity we have developed. We don't mind making mistakes. We want to push forward. And if we make a mistake, we come back, we adjust, we experiment, and we move forward, even if we make another mistake. And so we are not so afraid of making mistakes. And third, we are not so attached to whatever is achieved. Even before it is stabilized, we want to jump to the next, experiment with a variation, and so on. We will say the human mind is restless, the mind wants to change, the mind wants to grow. But if you notice, you don't do it consciously. You do it because of an instinct within the mind which wants less absorption in detail, less timidity of error, and less conservative attachment. The instinct in the mind pushes to something new, something more. If you go back to this mind in a tribe, where the power of the intellect, rationality, and abstract thought has not been so developed, where the mind is more obsessed with the sense experience of life, food, survival, basic comforts, and so on, organizational stability. If somebody attempts rapidly to do things which destabilize the community balance, everybody else will pull him back. They get insecure, they get afraid. And if the person persists against their fear, he is ejected from the community to protect the stability of the community. This is the conservativeness of the mind when it is in a narrower groove. But here, as the mind is opening to these higher possibilities, the instinct wants to move rapidly and even is not afraid to lose something gained in order to grow more rapidly. And so even in the conscious process of the yoga, you'll find these three tendencies, although they are inherent instinctively in this higher development. So, the very fact that this progress is attended by less absorption in the detail, less timidity of error, a less conservative attachment to the step gained, suggests all the following. And all the following is a very complex sentence. Suggests as much as it contradicts. So while suggesting, it equally contradicts what? The hope and almost the assurance that, and then he describes all this. So there is a hope, there's an assurance which is suggested by these three things. These three things suggest this hope and assurance that this will happen, but equally at the same time they contradict the hope and assurance that this will happen. Why? Let's look at what will happen and then we come back to the contradiction. The hope and almost the assurance that when the new principle emerges, it will not be by the creation of a new and quite different type, which separated after its creation will leave the rest of mankind in the same position to it as are animals to man. This will not happen. That a new type will emerge which will leave behind mankind. Now if you see in the normal steps of past evolution, each time a new power of consciousness emerging, there was a new species. There was the mammoth and then there is the elephant. The mammoth was more stupid, more dull, but the intelligence and self-awareness of the elephant created a separate species in its appearance. And the same we see in the fish or in the plant, whatever degree of animal. Among the human, let's say, ancestry in the apes, you have chimpanzees, orangutans, the apes, and each having distinct characteristics emerging have become separate species. So he says, it will not be by the creation of a new and different type. It will be humanity itself evolving into a new consciousness. It will not leave behind humanity as earlier species have left behind. It will not leave behind humanity as humanity has left behind the animals. It will be humanity itself which will grow into the new consciousness. How? If not by the elevation of humanity as a whole to a higher level, yet by the opening of the greater possibility to all of the race who have the will to rise. So the hope is first that the whole of humanity could rise like this. But if not that, then at the very least, it will open the way for all humanity. Those who want to rise can make that passage, but anybody in humanity who wants to rise can make that passage. And so he is showing two possibilities, finer possibilities. Will it be the whole of humanity that rises into this new consciousness? Or will it be that some part of humanity will stay behind as ordinary human beings while another part of humanity rises because it chooses to rise into this new consciousness, but they will still be human. They will not be a new species. And the way will still be open for the rest to make similarly this transition. Now keep in mind, all of this is describing the development of this power of the supermind to manifest, to organize and express itself in human beings. But subsequently, Mother spoke of a complete breakaway and separation, but the context is different. There she says, once this supramental consciousness has developed, and then it turns upon the body's consciousness and the tissue of the body, and recasts the body consciousness and tissue itself in terms of the supramental consciousness. At that point, it will be like a breakaway into a new species. And to that species, humanity will be what animals are to human beings. They may still retain the human-like form, but the substance of that supramental species and the operation of its organs and energies and the capacities it will express will be of a completely different order, sufficient to be able to call it a completely new species. Examples of what that would include, Sri Aurobindo has suggested, pointed to, where he says actually the heart, for example, as it is organized in the current biology, which must pump blood to spread nourishment, life force and energy to the whole body, would be replaced by a direct action of the energy itself spreading into the tissue and substance. The bone, for example, which is needed to provide support and stability and rigidity so that we can stand and lift and do things, would not have the same character. The substance of the body would be able to rigidify itself or soften itself as needed. The substance of body would be inherently plastic and free from limitations of the current biology. And therefore, it could even express in material substance the capacity to be immortal, the capacity to not age, decay and die. It may choose to drop the body, that's a different story, but it would not be compelled in substance as we are compelled by the nature of the substance wearing out, and so on. So that would be a different category altogether. Here Sri Aurobindo is not referring to that, he is referring only to the organization of the supermind emerging and expressing itself out of mind. And so we still see humanity in continuity, a higher level emerging, if not the whole, then at least the way is open for the whole who choose. Now this is very important because currently this is what we are seeing happening in humanity. There is a mass of humanity which has chosen to immerse itself in its instincts, even to express those instincts in a more crude and coarse way. And then a different, relatively smaller mass which is choosing to ascend, to rise, to separate itself and express its own higher capacities. And there is a kind of a split taking place. It does not mean that the split will be unhealable. It just means that there will be a distinct separation. And at some point, those who have chosen to immerse in instinct may choose the other way and would have the capacity. So if not by the elevation of humanity as a whole to a higher level, yet by an opening of the greater possibility to all of the race who have the will to rise. And this has to be a choice. There will be a push of evolution, but at some point the conscious participation is what will get you through across rapidly. That's why the knowledge of yoga is so important. So now we come back to the larger meaning of the sentence. He says, it will not be by the creation of a new and separate type. That is the hope. Almost, he says, the assurance. Almost the assurance. Because of the nature of these three things, less absorption in detail, less timidity of error, less conservative attachment to the steps. Therefore, we see it will happen rapidly in this way, in a continuity. The gradations would not be so distinct. There would be many intermediate steps fluctuating, forming like a continuous bridge all the way to the full expression of the supramental consciousness. But he says, suggests as much as it contradicts the hope. Why does it contradict the hope? Because at the same time, if there is too much of this fluctuation, there could be layers of instability created in the passage and a stability emerging at the top, leaving behind a kind of an unstable passage below. And so at the same time, we see the possibility of continuity of levels forming, or there is the possibility of something emerging rapidly and then the layers in between being unstable, collapsing, and a separation emerging also. And Mother has spoken of this, especially in the context of the transformation of the body, that as this new species emerges, there will be a bridge which will form, and at some point the link may even break, as it has happened in the past in the transition from the ape to the human. So this is all looking at all these possibilities and placing in front of us three characteristics which show this as the possible future. So I'll read the sentence once again and you see what it holds. And the very fact that this progress is attended by less absorption in the detail, less timidity of error, a less conservative attachment to the step gained, suggests, as much as it contradicts, the hope and almost the assurance that when the new principle emerges, it will not be by the creation of a new and quite different type, which, separated after its creation, will leave the rest of mankind in the same position to it as are the animals to man. But, if not by the elevation of humanity as a whole to a higher level, yet by an opening of the greater possibility of all of the race who have the will to rise. For man, first among nature's children, has shown the capacity to change himself by his own effort and the conscious aspiration to transcend. Among all creatures who are children of nature, products of nature's evolution, man is the first. And in saying first, Sri Aurobindo is suggesting something. That there will be other species, perhaps even on the brink are some species. When we see these very sophisticated dolphins, sometimes among dogs who are very close to human beings, who are almost human-like, the same possibility might exist that they may make an effort and have a conscious aspiration to transcend. But among all these possibilities, the human being, man, is the first, who has shown the capacity to change himself by his own effort and the conscious aspiration to transcend. I will close with a comment that the mother made when she brought with her certain paintings of monkeys. Very few things that she kept with her. And she put, those pictures are now displayed in Sri Smriti. And Mother explained that she preferred to look at these pictures of paintings, these pictures of monkeys. She preferred to look at monkeys than human beings, because in the monkeys there is constantly this sense of something they see in human beings, the possibility of a mind, and there's a yearning and an aspiration to develop that, although an incapacity. But in human beings, they're so self-satisfied, so dull and so shut that there's no aspiration seen. So for the mother, seeing that aspiration was much more valuable than to see this stupidity and self-contentment of human beings. But these are all signs that nature has not stopped with human beings. Nature is continuing this push of self-development through own effort and conscious aspiration to transcend. These two, when systematized and organized, are what we call yoga. Own effort and conscious aspiration to transcend are at the core of all yoga. Without these two, there is only a system, but no action. Conscious effort is the first, own effort is the first step, and the aspiration to transcend is what allows you to go beyond what your effort could take you to. Your own effort can only take you as far as your material is capable. But the aspiration to transcend allows something higher to descend, to align with your personal effort and lift you by its capacity to something which your own effort could never have taken you to. So just this one sentence captures so much. For man, first among nature's children, has shown the capacity to change himself by his own effort and the conscious aspiration to transcend. So we continue the last paragraph of this chapter next Sunday. We can meditate briefly for 5 minutes.